Okay. Dear friends, good evening, good day. It's my certain pleasure to welcome you all here for our continuous educational seminars. Today we have a very special presentation on the Holy Isle of Lindisfarne, which is one of the most important centers of Anglo-Saxon Christianity during so-called Dark Ages. And it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. David Patz, an archaeologist from the University of Durham, who is heading the excavations at the Holy Isle of Lindisfarne. Those of you who saw the announcement on Facebook, I did indicate that the archaeological history of Lindisfarne is really have been rather limited up until present day, and it just now that the island begins to give up its mysteries. And about some of those and histories we're going to hear from the man in charge. So David, thank you so much for coming. It's a distinct privilege. In November of 2019, when I visited there for the first time, I could not have imagined that I could meet some of those people who are actually doing work there. So it's a double excitement for me, but I'm sure for those who will be watching the recording of this meeting or those who are present, will be very happy to hear everything that you have to say. And then maybe at the end, we'll ask you some questions. So thank you very much for your time, and it's all yours.
I'll take it away. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Lovely to meet you. As Ilya said, my name is David Petz. I am an associate professor of archaeology in the Department of Archaeology at Durham University. So Durham University is in the north of England. And one of the things that connects, well, we will hear a little bit about how Durham connects to Lindisfarne, but in a very practical way, we have the body of St Cuthbert, the shrine of Cuthbert is in Durham Cathedral. So when I'm in work, which I haven't been much over the last year, but if I stand on my desk and peer out the window, I can just about see Durham Cathedral kind of poking up out in the distance. So it has always been this connection between Durham, Cuthbert, and Lindisfarne. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start a PowerPoint in a minute, but what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about the Holy Island of Lindisfarne and its early medieval archaeology. There's all sorts of other interesting things about the island that I won't have time to talk about. And also I'm going to use a discussion of Lindisfarne as a kind of way of talking a little bit about Anglo-Saxon monasticism. It's going to be seen very much through the lens of Lindisfarne, but hopefully it'll provide a little bit of context for you. So I'm just going to share my screen. So like a lot of university lecturers, I spent my last 14 months sharing screens and talking, giving lectures on Zoom. So hopefully, if someone could just nod, hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. So Lindisfarne, here we see an aerial view of some of our excavations. You can see our excavations are there in the front, with the area surrounded by the orange fencing. It's just to the, actually it's to the east, so north is to the right on this picture. So our excavations just to the east of the ruins of a later medieval monastery, which I'll mention briefly, which you can see those ruins, and then behind that further still is the parish church, which is relatively modern in the sense that most of it's 13th century AD. So as far as I'm concerned, that's quite up to date. And there in the distance, you can see the mainland of Northumberland. And there's this little island here I'm going to mention, which is St Cuthbert's Island, which is a small island off Lindisfarne. So for a lot of people, the reason why they've probably heard of Lindisfarne is not so much of the island itself, but because of the image you see on the right, which is one of the illuminated manuscript pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are one of the great works of art of the early Middle Ages, dating to, well, the early 8th century, probably, as far as we can be precise about the dating. It seems to date to that period. It consists, as the name suggests, of the four gospel books of the Bible, and it was almost certainly produced by monks on the Holy Island of Lindisfarne itself. And it's in the British Library down in London. It's a masterpiece of the illuminated manuscript craftsman's work. There's multiple pages with this incredibly complex and finely decorated Celtic influenced and Germanic influenced interlace and decoration. It's an absolutely stunning piece of work. But crucially, it was created in a monastic context in Britain in this period. Literacy in the 7th and 8th century, literacy is really something owned by the church. There's not much secular literacy, so it's not surprising that it's in the monasteries that we see these great religious texts being produced. Things like this were produced not so much for day-to-day use. Obviously, this is very much a Sunday best gospel, but it was about something like this would have been displayed to the faithful. Gift volumes like this were often created as gifts as well, and given to important churchmen by monasteries to kind of create friendship, create alliances. So we've got this amazing gospel book, which is celebrated internationally, incredibly important. But what do we actually know about the place where it was made? Well, as you say, we know it's created on the island of Lindisfarne. Now, I'm just going to shoot forward very briefly, just to remind you, because normally when I'm talking to a British audience, everybody knows what Lindisfarne is. But just for those of you who don't know your small islands of northern Britain, Lindisfarne sits just here on that red point there. So we are in the very far northeast of England, in the county of Northumberland, and we're about 10 miles south of the modern border between England and Scotland. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon period, that border didn't exist. There was no distinct thing called England and no distinct thing called Scotland. And the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria at this point extended far to the north into Scotland. It certainly included most of lowland Scotland, and it extended west over to the Irish Sea. So although we tend to think of it as being a northern English monastery, I think it's probably better to think of it as a central British monastery. And crucially, it's a site that has connections both with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south, the Pictish kingdoms of kind of northeastern Scotland to the north, and the Irish influence kingdoms of western Scotland over to the west. So Lindisfarne is on a cultural boundary or a cultural hinge point. We just go back to the key dates. I'm an archaeologist rather than a historian, so I'm not going to bog you down too much with lots and lots of dates, but it's useful to give you a little bit of a chronological framework with which to work. So Lindisfarne was founded in AD 635. It was founded by a Northumbrian king, Oswald, and a Scottish or Irish monk, Aidan. At this period, let's take a step back. Anglo-Saxon England was essentially pagan until the end of the 6th century. Christianity had been brought to Britain in the Roman period, and when the Romans left in the early 5th century, Christianity continued to be maintained as a religion in Western Britain, so Wales, the West, Cornwall, and it expanded into Ireland, and there from Ireland it then expanded back to the mainland into Western Scotland. So through much of the 5th and 6th centuries, you could divide Britain and Ireland into a Christian West and then a pagan East. And the pagan areas were the areas of central, southern and eastern England, into which some element of cultural influence coming from pagan Germanic areas from the continent led to the creation of a series of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and in that area a disappearance of Christianity. And Christianity is not reintroduced into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms until the end of the 6th century. AD 597, Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustine as a missionary to England, to start that conversion process to bring Christianity back to the Anglo-Saxons. Now, when he arrives in Kent, which is in the very far southeast corner of England, but very rapidly, Northumberland, which is way up in the north, also converts. And that's because the king of Northumbria at this point was very, very powerful. And one of the other most powerful kings of England in England at this period was the King of Kent. So the King of Northumbria wanted to marry his daughter to the King of Kent, and the deal was that he would be allowed to have his daughter marry the King of Kent as long as the King of Northumbria, King Edwin, converted to Christianity. So it's originally the conversion of King Edwin in the early 7th century that leads to Northumbria in the north becoming Christian. Now, here's where it gets a bit complicated. The tradition of Christianity which Edwin converted to was directly from Rome via the Frankish kingdoms of France. But Anglo-Saxon politics is very, very complicated. King Edwin, like most successful Anglo-Saxon kings, ends up being killed in battle. And after a brief intermission, the next major king of Northumbria is Oswald, the founder of Lindisfarne. Now, the trouble is, Oswald had been in exile in Western Scotland for quite some time. Essentially, that's because he was heir to the throne of Northumbria. And if you are heir to a throne of Northumbria, then you're heir to any Anglo-Saxon throne, then your life is normally at risk because you are seen as a political threat. So Oswald and his family went off and lived in Western Scotland. And that's where Oswald converted to Christianity. He converted to Christianity under the influence of the great Scottish monastery of Iona. The trouble is, or this sets up a slight problem, because the traditions of Iona were more connected with the Irish Church, and they had certain practices which were different from the Church of Gregory the Great and Augustine and King Edwin. So this is important because it'll matter later on. So anyway, Oswald becomes the new king of Northumbria. He comes back into his kingdom in Northumbria, and he founds a monastery on this small island. And it's pretty clear he's copying what he knows from Western Scotland, because in Western Scotland, the most important monastery is Iona, which is associated with St Columba, and that too is on an island. So it seems that Oswald is creating an island monastery of his own in his new kingdom. And Aidan, the monk who he brings to found the monastery, is directly from Iona. So essentially, Oswald is founding Lindisfarne as an Iona of the East. So for the first 30 years of Lindisfarne's existence, it was essentially a daughter monastery of Iona in the Northern Irish tradition of Christianity. But we have a problem, because the royal families of Northumbria end up having people who celebrate follow the Roman tradition of Christianity, and also have elements who celebrate the Irish tradition of Christianity. And whilst they're all in communion with each other, they're not in schism or with each other. They are two different traditions within the broadly Catholic Church at this point. And there's various disputes, most noticeably about the dating of Easter, but also about other things such as the tonsure that the monks wore, and various other minor theological matters. In practical cases, one of the problems is the kings of Northumbria. The king tends to follow the Irish tradition. His wife follows the Roman tradition. So because the date of Easter is different, the king is feasting at the end of Easter, having breaking his fast and having the great feast, while his wife is still fasting, because they're calculating Easter in different ways. So that, apart from anything, that's not a recipe for domestic harmony. And in 664, King Oswy, who's the next Northumbrian king, realizes that he's going to have to make a decision about which tradition of Christianity Northumbria is going to follow. And he, after a great debate at a monastery called Whitby, he decides to go with the Roman tradition. This is really important. This is a key point in the history of Lindisfarne, marking the point at which Lindisfarne leaves the Irish Church and becomes part of the more Roman tradition. So many of the monks from Lindisfarne leave after the Synod of Whitby and go back to Ireland and Scotland. And crucially, this is around the point where Cuthbert comes in. Normally, with an early medieval monastic site or monastery, the most important figure is the founding saint. So in this case, Lindisfarne, the most important figure really ought to be Aidan. But because of this change of religious tradition after about 30 years, it's a bit problematic, because Aidan is associated with the old order. So he can't really be seen as a respectable figure to be the central set of relics for the monastery. So they need a new central figure, and this is as I said, this is where Cuthbert comes onto the scene. Cuthbert grew up. We know there's various lives written of him, saints' lives written of Cuthbert. So from these, we know that he was born in what's now lowland Scotland, almost certainly lowland Scotland. He's probably from a noble family, but he joined the church fairly young. He goes through a series of different posts. He achieves a reputation for sanctity, and also I think for being a good administrator and a safe pair of hands. So he is offered the opportunity to become abbot and bishop at Lindisfarne, which he does for a while, and then he clearly has an urge. He clearly has the urge to be a hermit. So first of all he spends time on St Cuthbert's Island, the little island you can see in the background on the first picture, and then he goes out to the Farne Islands, which are another set of islands about 3 or 4 miles across the water in the North Sea, and that's where he lives out his final days and where he dies. And to be slightly cynical, the best thing Cuthbert ever did for Lindisfarne was to die, because he becomes that saint which becomes their central figure. So Cuthbert, his body is brought back to Lindisfarne. He's buried in the church in the main monastery, and then after 10 years, his body is examined and it's found to have been miraculously incorrupt. It's in perfect condition, which is seen as an indicator that he is blessed, he is a saint, and that's the point where his body is taken out of the grave and raised above the ground. And in the Anglo-Saxon church, that was the de facto way in which a saint was made. There wasn't much paperwork. It was really a process of becoming a saint by popular acclamation. So this is the point where Cuthbert becomes the key saint for Lindisfarne. Because Lindisfarne also has royal patronage from the kings of Northumbria, it becomes an incredibly important, the most important Anglo-Saxon monastery in this period. It's really well connected. It has, as I said, it has royal patrons, but it attracts a lot of patrons from the leading noble families of Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. It attracts a lot of pilgrims, bringing money and gifting land. So it gets to the point where the monks of Northumberland, the monks of Lindisfarne own a huge amount of land. They own big chunks of southern Scotland, most of what is now County Durham, a little bit further to the south, big chunks of Northumberland. So it becomes an incredibly important monastery. It's around this time that the Lindisfarne Gospels are created, probably as part of that process of promoting the cult of St Cuthbert. So things are going absolutely swimmingly for the monks. They are the monastery is powerful. It's a centre for learning. It's a centre for art. It has great support from the kings. And then in 793, it is attacked by the Vikings. And this is one of the first attacks by the Vikings on Britain. And it's probable that the Vikings were aware of Lindisfarne, were aware of its wealth before that. So it's not surprising that one of the first places they attack when they start those attacks is Lindisfarne. So we have this great attack. It's such a shocking event. It reverberates across Europe. We have holy men, scholars like Alcuin in the court of Charlemagne in France, writing about it. But actually, that doesn't mark the death knell of Lindisfarne by a long chalk. It's a one early attack, and then actually the Viking attacks slacken off for a while, and they only become more, they only increase in tempo in the 8th century, and finally, sorry, in the 9th century. And it's really only in 875 that the traditional story is the monks leave Lindisfarne in the face of those Viking attacks, and they take the relics of Cuthbert with them. They move around various places in northern England for a while before finally in AD 995 ending up with the relics of Cuthbert, founding a new church and monastery in Durham, where I work. And for those who don't know the area, Durham is about 90 miles to the south. Now, I've put in the brackets there allegedly, because it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I might talk about that a little bit later on. And then finally, in the late 11th century, the monks of Lindisfarne, the Viking threat has gone, and the monks have decided to stay in Durham, but some of them come back and refound and build a new monastery up on the island. So what do we know about Lindisfarne itself? Now, one of the challenges with understanding the church of the Anglo-Saxon world is that we have documentary evidence, we have the writings of people like Bede, we have the saints' lives, but they don't give us a lot of information about what life was actually, what monasteries looked like, what life was actually like, and on a day-to-day basis. I think one of the first things you need to understand about Anglo-Saxon monasteries is they're very, very different from later medieval monasteries. So some of you may be familiar with pictures of the great medieval monasteries of Britain from the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, places like Fountains Abbey and Westminster Abbey, where these are big stone establishments with a stone cloister, a square cloister with stone structures all the way around them, often quite compact. Anglo-Saxon monasteries are very, very different. Anglo-Saxon monasteries, on the whole, certainly for most of the early medieval period, the only stone building would be the church. Most of the other buildings would be wooden structures. They wouldn't have a central complex with their cloisters and the serried ranks of buildings around them. Instead, the buildings would be more dispersed across a larger area. So often Anglo-Saxon monasteries are physically just much larger, cover a much larger area than later medieval monasteries. And often they what we might call polyfocal, in the sense that they might have multiple churches scattered across the site. In most later medieval monasteries, you just tend to have the one central big church in the centre of a site. But Anglo-Saxon churches, and again churches in places like early medieval Ireland and Scotland, are more likely to have multiple churches spread across the area, multiple cemeteries. And we'll look at some of the archaeology of that in a minute. So this brings us to Lindisfarne itself, and you see a plan of the island here. Now, it's the first thing to understand is Lindisfarne is a tidal island. It's an island where twice a day, as the tide comes in, it is separated from the mainland, but twice a day when the tide goes back out again, you can walk or drive over to the mainland. It's only about a mile across at the narrowest point. And we know that it was like that in the Anglo-Saxon period because the Venerable Bede describes that very well in some of his writings. Now, if you ever get to visit the island, it's a absolutely beautiful place. So it'd be great if you one day get over to visit. Now it's fairly remote. We're about I suppose 2 hours south of Edinburgh, 2 hours north of Newcastle, and the island, about a third of it, the northern third of the island, the top side of the map here, you can see is mainly sand dunes and rough grasslands, whilst we have the village in the southwest corner, and then some fields and farms. Nowadays, when you come onto the island, you come along from a causeway running from the western end to the mainland. We know from earlier maps, such as this 18th century map, there used to be multiple access routes to the island. And we're fairly sure, we're not fairly sure, we know that the early medieval monastery is basically under the village there, which brings all sorts of practical challenges to us as archaeologists. Now, in many parts of Britain, the sea level has changed since the early medieval period, but actually in this part of England, we're at the point where rising sea levels in the south of England and falling sea levels to the north of England and Scotland have kind of evened themselves out. So the sea level around Lindisfarne itself hasn't actually changed that much, but there have been changes in the landscape. Most particularly, here you see a slightly closer plan of the village to the on my left-hand side of my picture. You can see we've got this big green splodge to the east of the village, and that was actually all open water until really the 18th century. On the map you see here on the right, this is a 17th century map, and it shows all that open water. So originally the village was on much more of a pronounced headland with water around it on three sides when the tide was in. When you look at the plan of the village here, you can see where my cursor is. Hopefully you can see though the ruins. You can see in the first picture, to the left of it is the parish church, and then you've got the village to the north. And nowadays, it's a small village, about 200 people live there, and in the summer it's very busy for tourists, in the winter a little bit less so. So one of the challenges, as I said, is we know Lindisfarne is very, very big. The monastery is very, very big. Probably the best site we can compare it with is Iona. If we know the extent of the monastery of Iona, and if we kind of overlaid the monastery of Iona over Lindisfarne village, it would cover the whole village and spill out either side of it. Much more extensive than the relatively compact later medieval monastery which you see the plan of here. So one of our challenges is, when we've been trying to look for the early medieval monastery, is that there's a village on top of a lot of it, which presents all sorts of practical problems. Obviously, we can't start digging holes in people's back gardens. There's houses, there's shops, there's all sorts of things, which means we can't easily get into it. But because it's a big monastery, because it's such a big monastery, we know it kind of spills out either side, and you'll see examples of that in a minute. But we knew that, we've always been fairly sure that the early medieval monastery, the monastery of Cuthbert and Aidan, was under that village. And the reason why we know is because, although there hasn't been a lot of formal archaeology done on the island before our work, certainly looking in the central area of the village, a series of fragments of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture have been found on the island, and they have tended to come out from the area around the village, and particularly around the parish church when people have been digging graves there. Obviously, it's been a village cemetery for around 1,000 years, so people have dug through it a lot. And when people have found bits of sculpture, we'll see some pictures of that a little bit later, they've come out from the parish church. So that's the area just here in the left-hand bottom of my picture. So we've always been confident that that is where the heart of the monastery is. Now, when we look at the plan of the later monastery, there's some really interesting hints, again, of the earlier monastery. Most of these buildings, as I said, which stand now are 11th, 12th, 13th century, even later. But there's something really interesting. If you look here, we've got the main church of the monastery, of the later monastery, and then we've got the parish church just to the west of it. And it's not perfect, but they are broadly aligned on each other. They're kind of in a row. And that kind of alignment of churches, multiple churches in a row like that, axially aligned, is actually quite commonly found on Anglo-Saxon sites and major monastic sites and major religious sites in places like France, northern France. So that's, again, quite a hint that we probably have preserved here the footprints, at least, of the earlier Anglo-Saxon churches, albeit heavily rebuilt in later periods. In the parish church, there are hints in the standing walls that we may have earlier fragments of Anglo-Saxon sculpture, Anglo-Saxon walling. And in the church to the north, when it was excavated back in the earlier 20th century, where the red lines are, they are the lines of an earlier stone building underlying the later stone church, which still stands today on the site. That later stone church is 11th century, so that earlier stone building has to be Anglo-Saxon. So again, good evidence that we're probably looking at the heart of our monastic site, Anglo-Saxon monastic site, lying beneath the later monastery. So here's a view across that site, and again you can see our excavations in the background there, the parish church, the later medieval monastery. But we're not the only people who've excavated on the island in the last couple of years. There's been another project we've been running alongside, great friends of ours, running a community archaeology project, looking at various sites across the island, and they excavated up on this rocky crag here. This rocky crag is called the Hjuff in local dialect. It's very distinctive regional accent up in that part of the country, and they call it the Hjuff. And it's a crag, which very hard rock, which looks down onto where we're excavating. It's always been known that there were earthworks running along the Hjuff, and a great archaeologist called Brian Hope Taylor had a little poke around at these earthworks back in the 1960s, but he kind of lost his archaeological mojo, to be honest. He wasn't having a good day, and he'd never really worked out precisely what they were. But this other archaeological project we're running alongside, they excavated it, and they found what looks like it could be a church. You can see it just about poking up above the turf there, and here you see it in a little bit more detail. And what we've got is something which looks very like an early medieval church. It's stone built, so probably the later part of the early medieval period rather than the earlier part. It's got two chambers, so you've got the main chamber, what we probably call the nave, and then a smaller supplementary chamber here. In Britain, in later medieval churches, this would be the chancel where the altar lies. But Anglo-Saxon churches are laid out in a slightly different way. And in an Anglo-Saxon church, the altar would probably be actually in the east end of the nave, and the smaller compartment would actually be a sanctuary where the priest and the celebrants would sit at certain points of the liturgy. So you've got this structure. It's almost certainly a church. With a slight caution, because we have nothing which says definitively it is a church. The plan is right, but we've got no sculpture, we've got no firm date on it as yet. But it certainly looks fairly persuasive, but it marks a church. And this is a reminder of what I mean about these Anglo-Saxon sites having multiple churches. I'm just going to go back to the previous picture. So you can see there's this church up here. There's two churches down there. There are hints at other churches elsewhere in the larger area. So you can imagine a site studded or dotted with churches and cemeteries. And I suspect what's happening here is probably similar to what happens at some of the early medieval Irish churches, where there's a lot of liturgical processing around the monastic enclosure, saying prayers, celebrating various kind of rituals and prayers at different points around the complex. And we know that the Anglo-Saxon church made great use of stone crosses, and these stone crosses would have been dotted around the monastery and would have formed the focus for various Christian ritual celebration. So that's great. That's one church, but that's not where we're digging. We're digging in this red square here. Now, the reason why it all looks strange and grey in the fields around the village are because one of the things we did before we started is what's called geophysical survey, which is essentially using a suite of techniques using measuring things like variation in the Earth's magnetic field, measuring variations in electrical resistivity under the soil, and they can help us as archaeologists identify features beneath the ground. And the reason why we did that is because, as I said, one of our problems is a lot of the monastery is probably under the later village. The only places we could potentially pick it up were in the green fields running either side of the village. So we had a fixed budget, a fixed amount of time. So before rather than just randomly opening up a trench, we do geophysical survey to help us decide where to put our excavation trenches. So we found lots of things going on. For example, down here on the bottom right hand, we've got this nice square structure. That's actually a second cloister for the later medieval monastery, which is really interesting. You don't often get two cloisters like that, but actually not what we're after. We're after something a bit earlier. We got a whole series, though, of features in this field to the east, and that's really where we focused our excavation. In our first season, we dug 3 small trenches, 2 in this field, and then 1 into this field because we thought we might have the boundary of the monastery, possibly that line running with those roads. It might be a big internal boundary. We hit lots of later medieval stuff. So very interesting, 12th, 13th, 14th century, but not what we were particularly after. However, down on the bottom right, nearer the monastery, we did find dateable early medieval objects in our first season. So we focused all our field work down there. So over the last 5 years, we've essentially been excavating within this red square. And what I'm going to do now is take you through the discoveries we've made. So briefly, our trench divides into 2 halves, divided by basically because there's a high voltage cable running through the middle of it. And we didn't want to dig through that. That'll go horribly wrong. Our site divides into 2, so we've got 2 trenches. This is our eastern trench. And as you can see immediately, there are lots of burials. It was clear that the cemetery extended out into what is now just a field owned by a local farmer, and he's grazed sheep. So we hit a cemetery, and using carbon-14 dating, we were able to show that this is an early medieval cemetery. It's not part of a later monastery cemetery. It's not another unknown cemetery. So we've got a series of graves here, and under British law, we're able to excavate these, although the bones will all come back to the island and be reburied within the parish cemetery. Here you can see some of the skeletons, but everywhere I'm putting my cursor right now is a skull, and there are just probably running into around 100 or maybe more skeletons here. It's a long-lived cemetery with individuals graves cutting through each other over a long period of time. So it's clearly an important long-lived early medieval cemetery associated with the monastery. We have some other strange features here, such as this big stone wall, which I'm ashamed to say we don't really understand what that is right now. We're trying to, we removed it last season, and we're trying to understand it. We've got some dating going on, which will help us fit it into the sequence. So we've got lots of graves, and they are all very well preserved, which is quite rare in northern Britain, where the soils are quite acid. They all on their backs, mainly on their backs, the heads to the west, feet to the east. No sign of coffins, probably simply placed in the ground in simple shrouds. No grave goods, apart from quartz pebbles. I'll talk more about those in a minute. And we've got, one of our questions was, is this cemetery, is this the monks, or is it somebody else? Well, we've analysed, we have a specialism in analysing human bone at Durham, and what became very clear quite quickly is that we had male skeletons, we had female skeletons, we had children, and we had babies. So we had the complete kind of demographic spread of individuals. And whilst you could become a monk at the age of 7, so the children didn't automatically mean it wasn't a monastic cemetery. The presence of women mixed up with men, and also the presence of babies, made it very clear that this was not a monastic cemetery. It was a cemetery for a lay or secular population. And it's the big question at the moment is, are these burials of people who have come to the island as pilgrims and visitors, or are these burial sites of the locals? And there's various techniques we're using to try and understand that. Generally speaking, so the burials are all very similar, but as I said, some of them are found with clusters of white quartz pebbles. So these beautiful translucent white pebbles, sometimes in the grave fill, sometimes we found them near the head, or in one case, I think that it's being held in a hand. Now, this tradition of putting white pebbles or white stones is quite, in a grave, is quite common in northern Britain in the early medieval period. And there are some references in the Bible to using white stones. There's references, but also it's a practice which seems to perhaps go back into pre-Christian times in this part of the world, because the quartz is shiny, it's translucent. When it gets wet, it's absolutely beautiful. And it does seem to be a kind of part of the tradition of the Irish and Scottish churches to use white pebbles to mark graves, either as piles on top of graves or in grave fills. What's interesting is we don't think there's any source of white quartz pebbles on the island. We think people are bringing them in from elsewhere to deposit in graves. We've also found burial markers. So these are fairly smashed around a bit because the site's being ploughed quite a lot, but they are small gravestones. So they're about the size of if you can see me in the corner of they're about 30 centimeters, a foot maybe high. And although they've been smashed around, they're basically parts of small stone crosses. So on the left, you can see the top of the cross, the arm there with a central sunken area, and that central sunken area probably had a glass or metal setting inside it. These things are probably painted originally as well, so they would have been quite colourful, probably would have been about the same size and actually quite similar in decoration to things like manuscript books like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Also, they carry names and inscriptions. You can see just about letters on here, and that reads Utfrith, which is an Anglo-Saxon name, and there's again fragments of runes there, and there's other fragments of names here. So these are again good indicators of what we're looking at is clearly early medieval. There's about 15, 16 of these burial markers have been found on Lindisfarne, of which we have found about a third of them. Now, our ones are more damaged generally than some of the other ones, but here you can see some of the more intact ones, and you get a sense of what they look like. And they form a very distinctive group of carved stones with these round semicircular heads, which are only really found on Lindisfarne. There's another group which have flat heads, which are found down at Hartlepool, which is an Anglo-Saxon monastery founded, or another monastery founded by Aidan and Oswald. But they're lovely little examples of the art of Anglo-Saxon stone carving. We've also got this, which is, it doesn't, I must admit, it doesn't look an awful lot, but it's one of my favourite pieces of sculpture. What you can see here is you've got these two parallel lines, central stem, what actually transpired to be a central cross, and then two smaller crosslets either side of it. Now, I was looking at that when that first came out. It was nice, I could see what it was, but it did puzzle me because there's no parallels to that anywhere in the sculpture of Northumberland or County Durham, the heartland of early medieval Northumbria. The only parallels I could find were over in the west of Scotland and even in Ireland. And I was hazarding a guess that this central stem would have had a larger cross on. And then on the left, you can see that stone at the bottom was that bit of stone I just showed you. And 2 years later, we found the top half of that cross. And what we've got is a central stone cross with little crosslets either side. Rather nicely, there's a really good parallel to that from a site called Whithorn in Western Scotland, which was actually another monastery of the Northumbrian church. So these two stones are very similar in size as well. So they're a reminder of those kind of connections that the Northumbrian church had with Scotland, as well as the Northumbrian church had with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms further south. This is our other part of our trench. And again, you can see we've got some skeletons coming out here. And I think as we excavate, we're going to find more burials. But what we're particularly focusing in at the moment, and we'll be focusing in on next year, or sorry, when we dig this year, is all this stuff going on here. Now, this is where you have to trust me as an archaeologist, because it's not easy to recognize what's going on here. But essentially, we've got two sets of activity. We've got the traces of a stone building, and then underneath that, an area of metalworking. Now, when I say a stone building, I'm not talking a elaborate stone walls. Simply, I'm thinking of a stone foundation layer onto which a wooden superstructure would have been erected. And if I go to the next slide, you can see it before we excavated it so extensively, and you can see we've got lines of foundation stones there. And it doesn't look much, I'll be the first to admit, but we have really good parallels to those kind of structures from other contemporary early medieval monastic sites. But as we dismantled that later building, we found what we thought here was going to be just an oven or a small kiln. I'm going to go back here. We kept on excavating it, and it got bigger and bigger. You can see this is kind of at the beginning of last year's season. We excavated that bit. And then I'm afraid I haven't got a picture of this, but over the course of last year's season, this whole area, if you follow my cursor, everything up to the kind of right-hand side of that turned out to be a massive scoop within which metalworking seems to have taken place. So what kind of metalworking am I talking about? Well, all sorts of things. We've got remains of blacksmithing, so just working molten bars of metal to make things like perhaps tools or horseshoes and that kind of thing, but also hints of iron smelting, so taking iron ore and turning it into ingots of raw iron for subsequent working. Also fragments of non-ferrous metalworking, so they're working copper alloy or bronze or brass. We've got fragments of drops of where it's been splashed. We've got at least one copper alloy ingot, just a bar of copper alloy. And then we've picked up all sorts of fragments of other indicators of metalworking. So crucibles into which things would have been melted, what looks like the lining of a furnace, bits of slag, so the industrial residue. And we're still analysing that back in the labs at the moment. But broadly speaking, I think we've got an 8th century AD early medieval metalworking area. It's a reminder that monasteries like this, yes, they are places of prayer, but also they are places of craftsmanship, craftsmanship making basic tools for farming the land, but also for making elaborate things like reliquaries and shrines and ornamented covers, holy crosses for priests to wear. So we've been making a wide variety of different types of material. This picture you see on the left is from a beautiful whalebone casket from Northumbria, maybe even made on Lindisfarne, who knows, showing, it's called the Frank's casket, and it shows all sorts of unusual scenes. But here we see a smith. You see he's got his tongs here, he's holding something in his tongs. This is his anvil, he's got a hammer there and some of his tools, and he's hammering away. So this is contemporary to the excavation, the site, things we found of our excavation. So it gives you a lovely little idea of what he might have been, what our scene might have actually looked like. Another really interesting thing we're getting is a lot of animal bone. And animal bone can tell us a lot about the diet of what the monks were, their day-to-day lives. And the monks are eating all sorts of things. So we've got a set of fairly basic animal bones. We've got horses, not surprisingly, cattle, not surprisingly, cattle very important for meat, but also, of course, it's calves that make the skin of the calves, very thin leather, which are used for writing the manuscripts on. So things like the Lindisfarne Gospels are made on calf skin parchment. So cattle are really important. We've got deer bones, you've got pig bones, sheep and goats. And again, sheep important not just for the meat, but also for the wool and also for dairy as well. There's a long tradition of sheep dairying in northern Britain. And things like dogs and rabbits and the kind of usual things you might find. But we're also getting bird bones. The bone preservation is excellent. So we've clearly got geese and chickens, so the usual things you find on any farmyard. But of course, we're also an island. We're an island in the North Sea. So we've got things like puffin bones, seagull bones, guillemot bones, other seabirds. So the monks are clearly eating seabirds as well. And whilst to modern tastes, that might be not something we'd be particularly keen on. We know, again, in Scotland and in places like Iceland, things like gannet and guillemot and gull and puffin actually still are eaten on one or two islands. They still form a foodstuff. Other more unusual things, thinking about the seafood, the resources of the island. We're getting fish bones, so they're eating things like cod. So they're going out probably quite deep into the North Sea. They're not just fishing in the immediate vicinity, so not just fishing from the beach. They're clearly taking boats out into the North Sea, doing probably long line fishing rather than with nets, but they're catching big fish like cod, and we've got all the fish bones. So we know we're not just importing processed fish from somewhere else. They're also eating lots of seafood. So things like oysters and winkles and whelks and those kind of things. Oysters nowadays you tend to think of as being very sophisticated, kind of a luxury, but back then they would have been pretty kind of basic food stuff. And we know that we know that of the Anglo-Saxons, these maritime resources were incredibly important. And in his ecclesiastical history, Bede talks about the wealth of the sea. And of course, Bede is a monk from Northumbria, from Jarrow, which is about 40-50 miles south of Lindisfarne. So he knows of what he talks. Other things, seals. One of the great things for the visitor, if you come to Holy Island, is you'll often see the seals swimming around the island. They beach on the beaches. We always go swimming in the water when we're out digging after a day on site. We'll go in the sea. Oh, and it's pretty cold. The North Sea, the North Sea in September is pretty chilly. But the seals will come up, to within about 10 meters of you and say hello. They're part of the landscape or seascape of the island. But also, unfortunately, they're part of the foodscape as well. We're finding seal bones, and it's clear that the monks were eating seals, and they're probably going for the meat, but also rendering them down for the oil, because you can use seal oil for lamps, for example. And there's various indications from early medieval sources that things like whale hide and seal hide were very good for making ships' ropes, because it was so tough, and particularly in salty water. So things like seals are probably being exploited in that way. And this picture on the right is of Lindisfarne Castle. There's a castle on the island as well. So these seals are very much part. Our site is just off the picture there, so they're part of our daily experience when we're digging. And finally, we've got whalebone. We know that the the Frank's casket, that image I showed of the blacksmith, that was made from whalebone. There's quite a few examples of whalebone carving in early medieval Britain, and we've got a couple of fragments of whalebone. We think it's an orca. We think this one is a killer whale, and crucially, again, you can see it's got knife cuts on it, showing that it's being butchered. They probably weren't going out whaling them, chasing whales in open water. It's more likely that they're just exploiting beached whales. And even in the last year, when obviously over COVID, the amount of shipping died back along quite substantially on the North Sea, the number of whale sightings and dolphin sightings increased massively just in the course of a couple of months. So one would anticipate that back in the early medieval period, the waters of the North Sea were kind of vibrant with kind of whales and dolphins and that kind of thing. So they would have been an important part of the landscape. And on the Frank's casket, there is this marvelous, almost haiku-like inscription, which reads, "The flood cast up the fish on the mountain cliff. The terror king became sad where he swam on the shingle, whale's bone." And this is a wonderful statement. It's saying how the whale that gave the bone for the casket, he was a beached whale. He was cast up on the mountain cliff. He was sad when he swam on the shingle. I think it's a beautiful bit of Anglo-Saxon poetry there. Other things we've got, reminders that life at Lindisfarne wasn't necessarily difficult. It wasn't necessarily austere. The range of food already tells us that, but we found things like this. This is an early medieval gaming piece for board games. It's only about a centimetre high, beautiful thing, very fine glass decoration with these little individual balls on top. They're about 2 millimeters high, and there's a hole drilled in the bottom which has now been patched up with a bit of lead or iron, but this fits into a group of early medieval board game pieces which we know from a variety of other contexts in Britain and on mainland Europe. So they're playing board games, they're playing, and not just cheap and cheerful board games, something like this. This is a really high quality gaming piece. There's a lovely parallel, actually, an even nicer parallel from a site a bit further north called Dundurn up in Scotland, which is probably a Pictish royal site. And here again, you can see a very similar kind of piece. So again, these are part of your lifestyle of the leading aristocrats. And someone like Lindisfarne would have had wealthy people coming there. At least one Northumbrian king retired to Lindisfarne, and interestingly, before he retired there, he gave them permission to be able to drink wine, because clearly he wasn't going to retire without being able to keep on drinking wine. So there's a little bit of self-interest there, but a reminder that, you know, someone like Lindisfarne, they'd be drinking wine imported from the continent. Life wasn't necessarily very, very austere, for at least some monks would have had a slightly better quality of life. And we see kind of this evidence for board games, for example, from a series of other early medieval monastic sites in Britain. And these are carved stone board games, gaming boards from monasteries, early medieval monasteries in Scotland, Inchmarnock and Port Mahomack, up in the northeast of Scotland. Other objects, you've got a fragment of a spindle whorl, so they're clearly spinning wool to make clothes. This is a dress pin on the right, so it would have held together a cloak, could have been worn by a man or a woman, and again, more likely to have been worn by a layperson than a monk, we think. But again, a reminder that these are the kind of objects people would have been wearing and using when they came to visit the island. And finally, our other key bit of discovery is we're finding increasing numbers of coinage. Really unusual, because the Anglo-Saxon world is certainly in the top half of Britain, so north of the River Humber, is basically a world without towns, with the one exception of York. But apart from that, the top half of Britain doesn't have urbanism, doesn't have towns in this period. There's no big centralized permanent settlements. The kings are constantly on the move. They might have a series of estates, but they're not central places as we might. Concentrations of coins at somewhere like Lindisfarne is really quite unusual, and I think it reminds us that the monasteries would have been the biggest population centres in this period. There would be more monasteries here, but more individuals living somewhere like here than at any royal site, and they are the nearest thing we've got to a town. So you can imagine trade and exchange going on here. consequently, it's not surprising we're starting to find increasing quantities of early medieval coinage too. So I'm going to draw it to an end now. We're still with archaeology. The fun bit is a bit when we're out on site, when we're digging, and it's a beautiful place to dig and work. But we're also, a lot of the work goes on back in the laboratories out of season. So we're doing a lot of analysis of the finds at the moment. So lots of work trying to understand all the different types of slag and metalworking stuff we're finding. We're going to go back and focus on that area this year. We're trying to find out more about the dead of Lindisfarne. As I hinted earlier on, we've got techniques which can tell us whether they were born locally, and if not, potentially where they might have come from. Are they from the island? Are they from elsewhere in Northumberland? Are they from Northumbria more widely? Are they from Ireland? Are they from the continent? Even are they from places like the Mediterranean? We have some techniques which can help us pick some of these things up. So we're starting to use those techniques on our human bones. We're also analysing them for things like disease and injuries. We've got at least one fella who's got a big chunk at the back of his skull knocked out by something very, very sharp. So whether that was a Viking or something else, we're not quite sure, but there's clearly people who've died violent deaths. And also we're just trying to understand the wider world of the monastery. Monasteries like this aren't islands. They aren't isolated from the wider world. They would have farmed the island. They would have farmed, basically, as far as we can work out, they owned all the land you can see. When you look at the mainland, everything you can see belonged to Lindisfarne, plus massive estates up in the hills to the west, most of southeast Scotland, big chunks of northern England further to the south of us. So we're trying to understand those landscapes. We're doing a lot of geoarchaeology on the island. I've got a fantastic PhD student who's trying to unpicking the history of the fields and how they've evolved over time. We want to do things like look at pollen, early pollen, which might tell us what kind of crops are being grown on the island in the Anglo-Saxon period. So lots and lots for us to do. If you're interested, do look at our website. The address is there. We are a crowd-funded project. So if you want to help crowdfund it, that's fantastic. That's where you go. We have, we're kind of working. We've got at least 5 more seasons on the site, so we're only halfway through the project. Still a lot to do, but I'm going to draw it to an end there. I've been talking for dead on an hour, so you've probably heard enough of me. But if you've got any questions, I'd be more than welcome, more than happy to answer them. So I will just leave that there. I'll stop sharing. I'll hand back over to Ilya.
David, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation, and it's just absolutely fantastic. And I encourage our guests to ask any questions. If you'd like to, please raise your hand so I can unmute you, or you can send the questions in chat. I'm going to read them. Meanwhile, as our guests thinking of their questions, I wanted to ask you, David, based in comparison to other perhaps Anglo-Saxon monasteries, as you indicated that most of the historical site is covered by the village, were Anglo-Saxon monasteries that was established very clearly, like by Aidan, under the Irish influence, female and male monasteries under the one abbot, or it would be very clearly just male monastery? And the second part of that question, were there any secular villages associated with the monastic community?
Well, to start with, yes, the question, we certainly know there were Anglo-Saxon nunneries before, particularly for the period before the Vikings. When we know of them, they tend to be double houses. So they tend to be a nunnery and a monastery on the same site, but obviously clearly distinguished, normally under a single abbot. So we know, for example, that Whitby, there was it was a double house. We know that Hartlepool was a double house, and there's various other ones. So certainly there's a good tradition of Anglo-Saxon nuns in this period. Though as far as we know at Lindisfarne, it was just a male-only monastery, and a lot of monasteries were also male-only, but there was definitely Anglo-Saxon nuns in this period. Yes, in terms of secular monastery, a secular habitation, yes, almost certainly. And we know from Irish parallels, where there's a lot better documentary sources, that often the monasteries would have secular tenants who were essentially secular. They weren't in holy orders. They weren't following a monastic rule, but they worked the land owned by the monks. Because the monks, they have more land than the monks themselves could ever possibly farm. So they have to have kind of secular tenants. Now, where they would live is a really good question. Presumably they had their own villages out in the wider landscape. Whether there was a secular community, a village on the island, we just don't know at the moment. My feeling is probably yes. Certainly at a slightly later date, there is someone has excavated what looks like a small farmstead on the north side of the island, which is a good contender for one of these secular small villages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Again, maybe from examples from a different monasteries, but probably to draw the parallel to Lindisfarne Monastery, those Viking raids, were they quite as devastating as, say, Alcuin describes them to be, where it would be completely wiped out, or it was just hit and run with maybe some possessions stolen and maybe a few monks led into captivity? Was it just impact of the sheer horror of desecration of the holy place, or was it really a tragedy that completely eradicated the monastery itself?
Well, there's two stories there. First of all, there's the broader Viking experience in Britain, where basically, generally, the Vikings go from smash and grab raiding. Then they start overwintering. Normally, they just come in the summer. Then they start spending time as a great army in Britain over winter, and they become more fixed, and they do actually become political players. So I'm speaking to you from York, where I live, and York, it was the kingdom was captured by the Vikings for all intents and purposes, and they left a permanent marker. So the street names around here in York are kind of Viking influenced, and some of the local dialects Viking influenced still. When it comes to Lindisfarne, it's a bit more complicated. Basically, that first raid gets all the attention, but as I said, it's very much a first raid. Then it picks up through the 9th century. Clearly, some of the monks and the key relics left Lindisfarne in 875. But it's clear from some of the other sculpture, which we can date, that somebody continued to be on the island after that point, and they continued to create Christian sculpture. So I think some form of monastery continued there after the main group of monks had left. And there's actually one or two documentary references which seem to back that up. Also, we need to think a little bit. We need to be careful about framing it as the monks running away from the Vikings, because when the monks end up in Durham, they end up 90 miles closer to the Viking Kingdom of York than when they started. They actually end up about 20 miles away from the edge of Yorkshire. So they're moving towards the Vikings. What I think you need to understand is the monks, because they have all this land, they would have had all these tenants. They probably, for all intents and purposes, they probably had their own army. They would have had their own fighting retainers. So they're incredibly powerful, politically, militarily, economically. And by the time you get to the Norman period, the kings of Northumbria are gone. The Viking Kingdom of York is actually gone. The only social grouping which survives is actually the monks of Lindisfarne in their new form in Durham. So yeah, so actually the winners out of all this, they're playing the long game. But by the time you get to the 11th century, yeah, the Vikings are out of power really. It's the monks keep on going, and that monastery at Durham, that stays there till the 16th century AD. You know, they are, in the long term, it's the monks who win, and the Vikings are just gone. So depending how you feel about Vikings, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Right. Question, you did mention that you are not a historian, you're an archaeologist, but maybe just out of curiosity, you'd be able to answer this question. Normans, when they came in 1066, and there was a great harrowing of England, they did alter the ecclesiastical face of the English church entirely. And many of the abbeys re-established were after the Norman fashion and different new sites. But nevertheless, the monastery at Lindisfarne is renewed. So why is that? Is it by those monks from Lindisfarne that lived in Durham who went back, or we don't know anything about that?
Yeah, we know that Well, basically, yeah. What happens is the monks of Durham, the Normans come in and then they start building the cathedral, and they support the monks of Durham. But the monks of Durham, they're very keen on history. They're very aware of their history, and they go through a phase of establishing new monasteries or re-establishing monasteries on their old possessions, on their old sites. So they go back. It's definitely the monks from Durham. They re-established the monastery at Lindisfarne, and there's a whole series of other sites like Jarrow, Coldingham up in Scotland, all monasteries, all land owned by the monastery of Lindisfarne, and then the monks go back and it's almost like reclaiming it, staking a claim on these lands. So yes, it's definitely Durham. And actually although it's very ruined, the church at Lindisfarne, the later monastic church, it's half fallen down now, but it's like a little mini Durham Cathedral. Even in the architecture, they're making very direct references to Durham Cathedral, which is an amazing piece of Romanesque architecture.
So just curious that Normans did not prevent that ancient cult and did not replace it with something else, but did permit monastery to be rebuilt and the like.
Yeah, they weren't. I think they realised they needed to strike a conciliatory line. You know, they were very clear who was in charge, but they felt relaxed enough to let them express some of their own local loyalties. Yeah, right. And Cuthbert remains the patron saint of Northern England and County Durham all the way through, and Cuthbert remains a really, really important saint, hence all the pilgrims. So,
do we know by any chance if there was any cult of Aidan's relics and if they're surviving anywhere?
Aidan's relics, we know that Aidan's relics were held on Lindisfarne until the Synod of Whitby, but then Bede says that some of his relics were then taken back to Iona. So some of Aidan's relics were probably taken back to Iona and maybe even some other Irish churches. There's also some hints that some of his relics, because obviously the body would have been fragmented, may have stayed on the island. And I think the suggestions that, you know, when they left with Cuthbert in the 9th century, they took some of Aidan with him. But, you know, there's this tradition of fragmented saints cults. So for example, Oswald becomes a saint in his own right, and his head was on Lindisfarne and his arm was on Bamborough. So yeah, so it's complicated, yeah, but certainly some of Aidan was culted, yes.
Some of Aidan, right. We have a couple of questions that were sent. Wondered what language the gospel was in. Covered look like Latin.
Yes, the language of the early medieval church across Europe was essentially Latin. So Lindisfarne Gospels are written in Latin, but in the 10th century, it was glossed, which means basically, so in the 10th century, somebody took this amazing piece of work of art, and they've gone through it, and they've written in little scratchy handwriting above all the Latin words. They have written in the Old English. So it's now the thought of doing that to something like the Lindisfarne Gospels is amazing. We wouldn't even entertain the thought, but yeah, someone did. We just literally, not even in very good handwriting, we just scratched in these Old English glosses along the top. So we have some, you know, really interesting insights into the language spoken. But yeah, but for all church business, it would have been in Latin.
Thank you. One more question, actually from your countrymates. Thank you so much for the representation. Are visitors, amateur volunteers, allowed to visit Lindisfarne during your next season? And meaning probably to participate, huh?
Well, we're full for volunteers this coming year already. But the great thing about our dig is it's in the middle of the field next to the church, so you can, if we're on site, come and talk to us. We love having visitors. We're always open to people. Yeah, and we'll be on site for most of September. So if any of you happen to be in Northern England at that point, do come and say hello. So yeah, and we have lots of social media for those of you on things like Twitter and things.
And so I posted on my Facebook page actually several videos taken with quadricopter, I think, and also little presentations. The bits maybe 2-3 minutes long.
Yeah, but yeah, we've got lots of little films
and by your colleagues, but they certainly do shed some light as to what's going on there. But probably people would like to volunteer. So do you allow amateur volunteers to come there to dig some dirt?
Well, we're crowdfunded, so I'm afraid it's like a field school model. So we have people have to pay. But the link I'll share that link as well. I'll just stick it up. I'll stick it in chat. So if anybody wants to look at find out more about it, or just participating remotely, the more the merrier. So let me just get that web address, and I should have memorized it, but I haven't. So right, I'll just put that into the chat. So if anybody's interested, they can.
David, if you'd like, you can send me the link, and I'm going to post it next video.
I'll send it to you.
There you are. Yes, so I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to post it next to the video, in the comment section. The question is curious: is it close to Hadrian Wall? What is about 100 kilometers north of it, or less?
Yeah, probably about 70 kilometers north of Hadrian's Wall. I think in miles on English. Yeah, so it's yeah, so probably about 70 kilometers, maybe slightly less. So we're outside the area which is ever seriously under Roman control. I mean, obviously the Romans have been and gone a long time before the monastery is founded, but yeah, it's well away from the Romans.
Bede's monastery, Jarrow, is right on the Hadrian's Wall, more or less.
Yeah, Jarrow is more or less bang on. It's just across the river from it. You could from Jarrow you could see Hadrian's Wall. You'd have to swim to get there, but you could have seen.
Right, in that area. Just
yeah.
Adding to the question. All right, the Holy Isle. Is there anything left there from the early medieval period, or there is really not much? Because somebody says like Cuthbert's Cell or something like that, but archaeologically speaking, not traditionally speaking, but archaeologically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, this is the trouble. Is Anglo-Saxon, as I said, they're all wooden apart from the churches, so nothing really survives, which is clearly early medieval. There's a tiny bit of stuff built into the parish church, which might be Anglo-Saxon, but you have to know where to look. It's not very easy. It's just a little bit of wall, which you can't really, not easy to spot. There's nothing big. There's hints of a small structure on St Cuthbert's Island, the little island, but even that's probably a bit later, probably rebuilt. So, but the church on the Huff, that is open to display now, so that is visible. And there's a visitor centre which has some of the carving and the stone crosses and things like that, so that's worth having a look at as well.
So example of a church and monastic cells like on Skellig Michael in Ireland, that would be very unique. So there are no parallels like that in mainland.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of the Irish material, places like, I mean, yeah, Skellig Michael, Inishmurray, and some of the big monasteries like Clonmacnoise, they're much more impressive. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of survival. And there are some wonderful sites. There's a church called Escombe near Durham, which is largely 8th, 9th century AD. So there are churches, one or two churches which do survive, but not on Lindisfarne, no.
Not on Lindisfarne. Okay. Well, dear friends, if you have any more questions, please either raise your hand or send them in. Were there findings of soapstone used for cross making?
No, we haven't got any soapstone. It's something we've been looking at because one of my colleagues is a specialist on stalactites and soapstone. So we don't have soapstone, but we do. The crosses are made out of the ones I showed you. They're mainly sandstone, and we've got some limestone. There's sandstone and limestone on the island. So yeah, that's what they're being made out of. I didn't really talk much about the sculpture. I mean, I could have given you another 2 hours on the sculpture alone. I didn't think that was fair. So, but yes, we've got some remains, fragments of what would have been quite impressive high crosses. So 2-meter high crosses, but they've all been fragmented over time. But yeah, they would have been locally carved. And Northern England has a lot of surviving stone sculpture of that type. We're compared probably more than anywhere else in Europe, to be honest, in terms of these stone crosses, apart from maybe bits of Ireland. But, yeah, it's a lot of it if you know where to look.
I know that at Jarrow, I believe there were some fragments of well, colored glass, I don't know if we call stained glass found, and also bits and pieces of colored pottery and everything else. If the chance given, well, of course it's purely speculative, but excavating at Lindisfarne, would you be looking forward to find some of these fragments? I mean, more of types of decorations, because it was such an important site.
Yeah, it's a kind of place where, if anywhere is having stained glass, Lindisfarne would do. Jarrow is a kind of slightly funny site because it's particularly and precociously influenced by Roman architectural traditions. So it's almost the exception to the rule I was saying about having wooden buildings, because Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth seem to have little stone cloistral buildings. But nonetheless, I think if someone like Lindisfarne, I would imagine at its peak the church would have stained glass. Now where we're digging, I don't think we're close enough to the church to pick it up, but yeah, certainly the kind of thing one would expect to find. In terms of imported pottery, yeah, there's imported pottery, Gaulish pottery from Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow. I suspect we're just a little bit too far north to get that. I mean, it's on my kind of a wish list, but we'll have to keep our eyes open. So we'll see. But but generally the area we're in, they're not making pottery. They don't have pottery in the early medieval period, as far north as where Lindisfarne is.
You did mention that alignment of the churches may pattern those of early Anglo-Saxon structures. Would it be possible for you to dig actually inside the later medieval abbey, or it's absolutely impossible structurally and because of the trust issues?
I don't think it's impossible. One of the problems is we're still trying to work out how much it was excavated in the early 20th century. The site was given to the government in the early 20th century, and it was cleared out as a kind of as for a heritage site. And there was archaeology done, but it was incredibly badly recorded. So we're not sure whether they just moved the rubble and put down some grass, or whether they actually really dug down and moved all the underlying stuff. So I would like to have a look at it at some point, and it's not impossible. We have to go through a lot of paperwork, a lot of hoops, but it ought to be possible in theory to do a little bit of excavation there. So that's on the wish list at some point, but we've got our hands full at the moment with the other stuff. So, and obviously we can't dig in the parish church, because that's an active church, and the people are still being buried in the churchyard, so we don't want to do that.
All right. Well, wonderful, David. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I mean, it's a true joy, and I thank you all the guests who have attended today. The recording of it will be available on YouTube. I'm going to post a link on my Facebook page. David, I'm going to send it to you in an email. And I do thank you everybody for attendance, and of course, David, for your time and the knowledge. And somehow hope to stay in touch. And maybe when we'll come there with a group, we'll seek you out and
absolutely, yes. If you're around,
meet in person.
More than happy to if you get over there. Yes.
Thank you so much, and be well, the best of health, and please see for our next postings, because we do have some interesting speakers coming up. And
I'll keep an eye out, absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
I need to go and get my children to bed now, so I shall say goodbye to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Ilya.
Bye-bye.